and origin and development of this area by people of various backgrounds, ethnic groups, cultures, and so forth. That's the way it has always been. But then, guess what? Like anything else, money and power got involved. And human exploitation. So when you start trying to exploit humans for whatever reason, you got to come up with a way to justify it. So while we were building this democracy and constitution, we at the same time created a caste system by race, which had nothing to do with the critical race theory. So if you hear anybody talk about critical race theory, it was made up, or it is part of a research focus. Here is my critical race theory of today, in which I have always used, and anybody from Bertie County know where I'm coming from. If you are from Bertie County, and I'm including Chowan because all of it was Chowan first, and you can trace yourself back to 1640. Some of you can go back farther than that. But if you can go back to 1640 and those areas, either by document, and if you know you're going to eventually find out that you are related, whether you're black, white, Native American, or whatever. Wasn't that many people here. So if you had a family and so forth, males in here, and you wanted to have children and so forth, you had to look around and see what was here. So if you saw something with a dress on, and it looked funny, sooner or later Mother Nature took its course, so you had a family. And that all went on fine until 1750. Notice I haven't gotten back to 1619. In 1619, people were already doing what I'm talking about, and the slaves that came here, much to their surprise, if they didn't make anybody mad, in 3 to 7 years, they were free. They were not called slaves, they were called indentured servants too. On the ship, they were slaves because when they came in, that's what they were. But when they stepped off the boat and got over here, people had thought about keeping you for life and so forth. So you end up being treated like all of the indentured servants were. And by the way, they were not treated nice either. So before the blacks said the whites didn't have the experience we had, oh yes, they did. And that's why you got along and why you married and so forth. You were treated the same way, you was in the same places, you were out in the same fields and so forth, and so on. So what we have now is somebody out here saying, under the guise of critical race theory, that they don't want those stories told. That's what I want you to understand where that's going. So that's the other big lie we got. So I think I have said enough to get us started, and now I'll let the speakers be a little bit more academic than I have been. But I can back all of that up with academic and research if we have to. One other statement I want to make. When Hope started doing that, there was a group I was working with in Chapel Hill called the Center of Entrepreneurship. And one group out of that group decided that they wanted to do a study of the groups that came in called the Lost Colonies. Now they were in it for money. They had figured if they could get all of that, they could end up, and they bought land. They had a big plan of what they were going to do, and they started some of the things we see over here in Bertie County, down on the waterfronts and so forth. They figured that if they got all that in there. So I thought I would let you know that the university had a group in there that were in it for the money. So they came down to Bertie here and heard I was here, because I worked right up in Chapel. I worked right there in Durham, and Chapel Hill and Duke and Central had cooperative and collaborative research groups. So they asked me, what would I do to find the lost colony? And I said, well, you know they're here in Bertie somewhere. I said, but you out here looking for it through archaeology and all of that. I said, I would go straight to DNA. And they said, why? I said, because here is my theory. Just about everybody here is related and so forth. And if that's true, you don't have to stratify. You stratify later. Always look for homogeneity first. A lot of researchers don't do that. But if you're doing things where you're trying to generalize, you always look for homogeneity first. So in that case, you would just ask the question, are you from Bertie County? And if they are, give them the test. And sure enough, they did what I said. And guess what? Everybody they found that fit the criteria 1641 and on down from there and so forth, black, white, or Native American were related. And that was very shocking. So I don't care what anybody said. Mother Nature had the last word. Go look up their birth records and all of this other stuff. But when you get to that DNA, it's out there. So I thought I would let you know. We found through DNA who was here, and everybody was surprised. You know all of those Native Americans that are in Robinson County? Guess what? The three tribes down in this Tuscarora, Maharians, and so forth and so on are all mixed. And then there are white folks from down here mixed in there with them too. And we the first thing that came out on me was Berry and Laurie down there in that county. And the lady even sent me the pictures so I could see what they looked like. One of them looked like my great-grandfather. Everywhere outlaw. Okay. So I'm saying all of that before we even discuss it, that we don't even need to get into discussion about whether this is true or not. We know it's true. What we are trying to do now is to look at how we can recognize this and how we can reconcile it with where we would like to be as a democracy. And that's why we're having this. And I am so glad that we had our second speaker. It's hard to get a white person to come out and tell the truth. I'm telling you just like it is. It's hard to get a white person to come out and tell the truth on this stuff. So when we found one, he was on Facebook, and he didn't know I was out there like a bishop. And he asked the right question. I said, oh, he's the one right there. I went on Messenger and got it. He asked the question. I said, well, you come and answer it. So that's how we got him. Now, our first speaker, we've had here before, and he is considered authority on the subject. He's done his dissertation at Chapel Hill on the subject. And so today he's going to share with us in his own way what I'm considering a basis for what we would do for the rest of the day after we have the two speakers. As we go along, there's enough time in to ask questions and so forth. I thought it would be better to do it that way than to try to get people back for a question and answer session. So we will allow the speakers, and if they get carried away too much, I will raise my hand and say, okay, we need to move on, because we do need to be through by 12. And thank you all for taking the time to be here. And I do want to recognize a group from Edenton called the Racial Reconciliation Group, right? And we do reconcile and we reckon, don't we? Sometimes we get on each other's nerves and we'll be real nice about it.
That's nice.
So let's do that again today. And I also want to thank, did you stand up and tell them who you are?
John Bunch.
Okay. And right up here with the yellow, I'm recognizing you.
I'm Gregory Tyler.
I know this, but Gregory Tyler, wait a minute, Gregory, get right back up. I'm in charge today. She usually runs everything. Gregory took charge of the program in terms of getting us to get to the point that we call it the Genealogy and Family History Fair. She thought it would be good if we got all the plantation people who had records and so forth to come out and be available to share records from that they have personally from the various families that might be here and be connected with the African Americans that were here. And that was a very large program. So we want to thank you for doing that. That's when we started. We had some of the genealogical programs before, but we had not called it the family history and genealogy thing. Now we call it family history because family history means that it is documented. And the genealogy part for me is the DNA. And by the way, you can have DNA connection but not be family. Family is tied by culture, what you've been taught, what you believe, and so forth, based on the family you were with. So I thought I would put that in conceptual context too, so that we won't be talking over each other and so forth. So remember, family means that that's who you grew up with, so forth and so on. That's where your culture comes from. And DNA means that that's where your biological genetics comes from. And by the way, I always tell people, I love to go with my family, because I can't control that DNA stuff, and I might not involved in something I need that fits DNA. So I'm just being honest. Okay, so now right on and take over.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Speller, for that introduction. All right, so I wanted to talk with you all today about North Carolina's free people of color. Some of you all have already come to me, and we've talked briefly. Thank you all for coming out. What I'm going to do is just go through a few slides and give you a brief synopsis of the book and some of the sources that I used in my book. And then hopefully we'll have enough time that if you have a few questions or something, I can answer those as well and figure out where you all are at. Because I know some people here know a lot about the topic of free people of color, and other people probably don't know much. Let's see here. I'm about to use the keyboard today. All right, so what I did for this is I kind of set it up where there are questions. So some of these might be preliminary questions that you are thinking about, but if you've got other things, we can talk about those. So the first question is, can you explain exactly who were free people of color and who fell under this category? So if you're thinking about the language of the time, the terminology that was used in the 1800s, 1700s, you would have had people who were described as Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, or mustees as being categorized as free people of color. A shorthand for that would be thinking of people of African descent and or Native American descent. They were categorized as free people of color if they were free during the period in which slavery was legal. So those are the people who fall into that group. And this is a quotation that I found in the primary source from William D. Valentine. So William D. Valentine lived between Bertie County and Hertford County. And so this is a quotation of how he describes what a free person of color is. And so it says, free Negroes are slaves and their descendants emancipated by Quakers and other benevolent whites. Once owners of them, the mulatto is the offspring between the white and the Negro, or between the Indian and the Negro, or between the white and the Indian. And then in 1857, the North Carolina Supreme Court defined what it meant to be a free person of color. And so their definition says free persons of color may be then, for all we can see, persons colored by Indian blood or persons descended from Negro ancestors beyond the 4th degree. And so they have this idea that you can actually count generations and how far people are from a particular Negro ancestor or Indian ancestor. Now, how it actually worked in day-to-day life was a bit different. Local knowledge, appearance, things like that played an important role in how people were defined racially. All right, so how did I become interested in the topic of free people of color? So my interest grew out of my research on my own family. I have ancestors who were free people of color, some of them from North Carolina and some of them from Virginia. And so I started doing family research. That's where I first heard about free people of color. That led me to the archives and the courthouses. And from there, I was able to start learning about my family, but also other families that were connected to my family. And as that got bigger and bigger, I ended up writing about free people of color when I was working on my undergraduate degree at North Carolina State, and then continued on with that in my graduate work. And as Dr. Speller mentioned, I wrote a dissertation on free people of color in North Carolina. And so the book that some of you all have is based off of that dissertation work. So what topics do I cover in North Carolina's free people of color? So this is just a chapter outline to give you some idea. So my first chapter, Making Race, Remembering Freedom, that part of the book discusses what it means to be a free person of color. How did people in everyday life determine who was a person of color, who was white, and then also how did they document who was a free person versus who was not in free. The second chapter, Colonial Liberties, Colonial Constraints, that chapter deals with the situation of free people of color in the colonial period. So in that chapter, I discuss a lot about the class differences between free people of color. So you had some free people of color who were poor, members of the servant class, while you did have some other free people of color who were successful enough to be slaveholders. And so I talk about those contrasts in their life experiences. The third chapter, Debating Freedom, is about the political contest around free people of color. So what I think, as Dr. Speller hinted, but for those who will read about this will understand, is that the political position of free people of color changed over time. So in the colonial period, free people of color, the level of discrimination in the law was relatively limited, but by the time we get to the Civil War, there's a greater increase in the number of restrictions on the lives of free people of color, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The fourth chapter, Community and Conflict, that talks about the situation of free people of color in their communities in North Carolina, how they interacted with their neighbors, both enslaved and free, when it comes to business, church, education, things of that nature. And then I also talk about some of the challenges that free people of color encounter with their neighbors. The fifth chapter, Freedom and Family, focuses specifically on the family lives of free people of color. So those people who are interested in genealogy might be particularly interested in that chapter. Chapter 6 builds back on what I had talked about in the colonial period, but looks at this in the 19th century, where I'm looking at the differences between free people of color based on class. And in that particular chapter, I'm able to build a little bit more, give a deeper analysis of the situation of free people of color in the 19th century and how that played a role beside the discriminatory laws that dealt with free people of color. Chapter 7, Guilty or Innocent, is about the place of free people of color in the courtroom. So I'm looking at what free people of color could do both in the criminal courts, but also in the civil courts, how they were treated by the courts. So, we have these laws on the books, even in our own time, where the law on the book says one thing, but in order to understand how the law actually worked, you need to look at the court records to see how things operated. So, we have laws on the books today that suggest that it's, illegal to drive over 55 miles per hour, right? But how is that actually working in the real society? Who's being picked at with that when using that law? Which people are not? Which people that law does not apply to? So you need the court records to get an understanding of that. And then the final chapter, The Fight for Liberty, is about the role of free people of color in the Civil War period and in Reconstruction. So after 1865, trying to explain how free people of color used their privilege as free people in the pre-Civil War period to impact life in North Carolina after the war. Because of course, free people of color, as being free individuals, they were able to, in certain cases, obtain education, to own property, and they were able to use that after the war to gain political privilege, social privilege in certain cases. All right, so I wanted to talk about sources, what kind of sources I used. That might be helpful for people who are maybe a little bit more advanced in their genealogical research and want to understand where they can find free people of color in the records. Most of the records that I used for my project came from the North Carolina archives in Raleigh. I also did research in Chapel Hill at the Southern Historical Collection, in the county courthouses. East Carolina has a library, and there's some primary source materials there. The National Archives is also really important, especially for that final chapter of my book where I talk about the Civil War. And so some of the things that I'm going to go through would apply for people who are doing research beyond just the topic of free people of color. I mean, there are Civil War pension records for people of all different backgrounds in North Carolina and beyond. All right, county court minutes. So county court minutes were really central to my research. If you want to have a sense of what's going on in day-to-day life in a particular county in North Carolina, the county court minutes are a great place to look. This is where you find information about not just court cases, but people who are being apprenticed out. There are mentions of land sales, deeds, things of that nature. And in some counties, you may have a good record in the county court minutes and not such a good record in the deed record, so it also is useful to fill in some gaps. I found that particularly useful when I was doing research on Hertford County, north of here, for the book that some of you also have. In county court minutes, they're a record that go back into the colonial period, so if you're interested in researching the colonial period or into the 19th century, there are court minutes that exist for that. Criminal and civil action papers. So the criminal and civil action papers are another source that were key to this research. They work really well with the court minutes, because what happens is the court minutes will often mention that there is a case, and it may tell you what the case is about. So maybe somebody stole something, and you might get the outcome of the case, but you don't know who the crime was committed against, who are the people who testified in the court case, and so these papers are often very useful for figuring out that information. And again, it's uneven when it comes to doing research. Some places these papers exist, other places the papers have been burned up, destroyed, so it really depends where you're interested in looking. But in the state archives, they're classified in two different ways: criminal action papers and then civil action papers. So the civil action papers are where people are suing one another. Criminal actions are where somebody's committed a crime. And sometimes some other things fall in those papers as well. Apprenticeship records. So these are really key sources as well to learn about the status of free people of color and their work, their labor. And so in this particular record, you see Patsy July Blango. This was from Beaufort County, and she's being apprenticed to learn the trade of a spinster. And so this particular record came out of county court minutes, but there are also loose apprentice records that give this type of information, or maybe even greater details. And again, the quality of records varies often from place to place, even from time period to time period. Pension records. So I had mentioned pension records. They were a key source for my work. I used particularly pension records from the American Revolution and from the Civil War. And so these are a place where you can find firsthand testimonies about life. They're good for learning about the Civil War experience or the Revolutionary War experience, but there's also a lot of valuable genealogical and social historical material in these pension records. Sometimes there's good health records as well, especially if you're thinking about the Civil War time period and trying to learn about, maybe you had an ancestor who suffered from certain ailments and you're interested in that. That information often appears in pension records. And the pension records can be found in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives. Newspapers. So I use a lot of newspapers in my research. The quality of newspapers, again, they vary from place to place. Often you need additional background research, say a census record, which would be something that you would start off with if you're doing genealogical research, in order to get a sense of the people who live in a community, to then be able to identify who is who. So for instance, you see in one example, it says E.B. Revels, barber, hairdresser, and perfumer. So E.B. Revels was a free person of color, and he had a business in Lincoln County. Now, there's nothing in his advertisement that says he's a free person of color, so I needed to know that information ahead of time and then go through the records and locate something like this. In the second example, we see a advertisement for a reward for a few people who had escaped jail. And so one of these people, Jacob Pammons, is listed as a mulatto. So if you were to do, say, an internet search and go through an internet database for newspapers, which there are a few of them out there, you could, search for mulatto in this Pammons family or Wilson family or other names that appear in that advertisement, it might come up. But you still need to have some type of sense of either names of people in the community, when these people are living, in order to find these records. All right, so how many free people of color lived in North Carolina, and where were they located in the state? So by 1860, there are approximately 30,000 free people of color in North Carolina. As far as the southern states are concerned, there were only more free people of color in Virginia and Maryland in that time period. So North Carolina had a pretty significant population of free people of color. They were located primarily in the eastern part of the state and the middle part of the state. So in this region, thinking about places like Pasquotank County, Hertford County, Craven County, Beaufort County. You're thinking a little bit further southeast, Robeson County had a large number of free people of color. To the center part of the state, thinking about Wake, Granville, the old Orange County, which would have included Alamance. And there's several others, and when we're thinking about large population, I'm talking about maybe 1,000 free people of color in a particular county. Then there's several others that would have had maybe about 500, 400 free people of color, places like Bertie. How did the experiences of poor free people of color contrast with the lives of the more well-to-do free people of color? And so as I mentioned, that's one of the chapters in my book. I talk about the subject. But what we see is that there are differences in access to wealth, to power and privilege based on whether you are a poor free person of color or a well-to-do free person of color. So I mentioned that some of the well-to-do free people of color, both in the colonial period and into the period immediately before the Civil War, were slaveholders. And so that clearly is a very clear symbol of their power and position in society. But the vast majority of free people of color were not in that situation. And so the poor free people of color, many of them were landless. They were working as servants. Their children often were the ones who were subject to the apprenticeship system. So what would happen is that the court would take their children and bind them out to somebody to learn a trade. Now, what kind of trade you might learn varies. So some people are learning trades where they will be able, after they finish their apprenticeship, to actually start a business, make some money, maybe as blacksmiths, carpenters, people who work on ships, things of that nature. But then there are also a large number of free people of color who are bound to be servants. I mean, that's literally what the record will say, is you're going to work for maybe 15 years, starting in your childhood up until the time you turn 21, to learn how to be a servant. and that's what you're going to come out with, or as a farmhand. And so a lot of those people are not going to have the same advantage as somebody who would have been trained to be a blacksmith. All right, and so this is a newspaper ad about Marianne Bowen, and in this advertisement you can see that what has happened is the person she was bound to charged that her mother had taken her away. So what happens when you're apprenticed out, you're basically under the guardianship of the person that you're bound to, not your parent. And so there's this conflict between parents often and the people that their children are bound to, because the parent wants to have some type of control over their child, right? And so the only way to do this legally is either to get the way to do it legally is to get the court to relinquish the or end the apprenticeship. But if that doesn't happen, there are parents who take things into their own hands. And so in this case, Marianne Bowen's mother took things into her own hands, went and got her daughter and ran off. And so the challenge that a lot of families face is that their children have been apprenticed out, they're poor, and they don't have access to their children's labor. Whereas if the child remained with the parent, maybe the family would be able to be in a better place financially, but they're not able to do that because of the apprenticeship system. And this particular document here is a permission slip for Rachel Sampson to keep her own child. So the person that had the apprenticeship on her son is giving her permission to keep her child until he decides that he wants the child. So this type of situation would occur when the child has been apprenticed out at a very young age, and maybe the person who has the apprenticeship on that child would prefer that the parent take care of the child at her expense versus him taking care of the child at his expense. So that's what's going on in this particular situation. And so in this document, he's saying that he'll come back and get the child when he sees fit to recover that child, and then he would take the child and maybe put the child out to work on his plantation farm, whatever. All right, this is a picture of Thomas Day's workshop. Thomas Day appears in my book many times over. He's one of the more well-to-do free people of color that I was talking about. This workshop is located in Milton, North Carolina, which is just south of Danville, Virginia. You can actually go and visit and see the building. This is the original building, it's the original workshop. And so Thomas Day was a cabinet maker, and in his cabinet making workshop, he had apprentices, he had journeymen who worked with him, but he also had enslaved laborers as well. And these are enslaved people that he held and owned. All right, can I tell you more about the relationship between free people of color and the law? So I had mentioned I was going to go into that a little bit more. And what was the legal status of free people of color? How did it change over time? So when we're thinking about the colonial period, as I mentioned, there's a relatively limited number of laws that deal with free people of color. The ones that I would say are particularly important are those dealing with apprentices. So a lot of the laws are specifically regulating apprentices and servants, and so that you'll see discrimination between white servants and servants of color in the law. And then also by the 1760s, we also have discrimination in the courtroom. So in that time period, and this happens in North Carolina and other parts of the South as well, there are laws that prevent free people of color and enslaved people from testifying in court against white people. So if a white person commits a crime, a free person of color is a witness to that crime, that free person of color cannot testify, no matter what. Now, sometimes there are ways of getting around that. So in certain courts, they would listen to say-so evidence, so the free person of color could tell a white person what they saw, and then the white person could go in court and testify and say, this is what I saw. But that doesn't always happen. And so there are cases where everybody in the community knows that a crime occurred, they know who did it, but they can't actually prosecute that person because the only witnesses are either enslaved people or free people of color. It's also an issue when free people of color are trying to sue white people for damages, or they owe them a debt. Occasionally that's a problem as well. Sometimes free people of color are able to win court cases against white people, but sometimes they're not because of this colonial period law. As we go deeper into the end of the 18th century, into the 19th century, there are a variety of other laws that are passed by the General Assembly that affect free people of color. By the time we get to the Civil War, they're not allowed to sell liquor. Their voting rights have been taken away. So in 1835, the North Carolina Constitution is changed to prevent free people of color, free men of color specifically, from being able to vote. So before 1835, they were eligible to vote. And that North Carolina was one of the few southern states that allowed that. There are restrictions on their access to the public schools. So public schools are reserved specifically for white people. So free people of color can have their own school, they can get private education, but they're not allowed to go to the public schools. And so this article I find really interesting. This is about the disfranchisement that took place in 1835, where free men of color lost their right to vote. And so it's a quotation, it's in my book as well, where one of the members of the assembly that decided to disfranchise free people of color explains why he went about doing this. So if you read the debates that took place before free men of color lost their right to vote, there's a lot of discussion about things you would expect. So free people of color are, too dumb to be able to vote. Their status in society is too low to allow them to vote. Things of that nature. But by the time we get to see this article, we recognize that there's a little bit more going on. And so he's explaining that this is political, that free people of color don't vote for him. And so therefore, he doesn't want them to have the right to vote. So that's one of the underlying things. Yeah, I mean, so this is something that's been going on for a long time. Where, people are using discussions about slavery and racism to cover up their other agenda, which has to do with political power. All right, so that's all I've got. I'll take questions. I think we have a few minutes. Yeah, we do. We have a little bit of time. Yes, sir, in the back.
And in 1850, a part of the compromise there is that the enforcement of the fugitive slave law.
Right.
How does fugitive slaves, how does that affect the lives of free people of color?
How does the fugitive slave law affect the lives of free people of color? That's a good question. In the context of North Carolina, I haven't seen any evidence of a serious effect in the context of North Carolina. Now, when you get further north, I think it becomes much more of a problem because you have some people who have maybe escaped North Carolina who were enslaved and they've gone to live in New York or Massachusetts or somewhere like that. And now this law is in existence that further supports their recapture and requires other people to be involved in that recapture. And so those people are affected. You also would have some free people of color who may have been supporting people's escapes. And so those people would need to be more cautious, of course, under this law. Of course, to clarify, there have been multiple laws in existence requiring the return of fugitives. It's in the Constitution. As well as there was a law passed in the 1790s that gave slaveholders the right to recover enslaved people. And so that part of the 1850 compromise that you're talking about, is reinforcing that and giving it more teeth.
In your research, could you identify communities within North Carolina during the Reconstruction period where free people of color experienced the greatest success, and contrary, which communities in North Carolina experienced the least success during Reconstruction? If you know, I know that's a generalism,
Right.
but just a few cities maybe that stood out in your findings
Right.
of success during Reconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm thinking just quickly about successful places, Wilmington, North Carolina comes to mind right away. I mean, Hertford County, people there were able to establish a school that a lot of people in this region went to. Elizabeth City, those areas, Craven County and New Bern. Less successful, I mean, probably anywhere out west in general. I mean, most of the West free people of color are a relatively small part of the population. I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, yeah. And I mean, there would even be some areas in eastern North Carolina as well that probably the free people of color aren't doing particularly well, because they were, in the pre-Civil War period, they were landless, mostly working as servants. Right offhand, I would imagine somewhere like Greene County, that area, people are probably not doing so great. But, like I said, there's always one or two exceptions. Yes.
I was wondering, how did most of them become free? I know the slave owners could free them.
Right.
Or if they were in an interracial relationship, that they could be born free.
Right.
So was those pretty much it?
Right. So, yeah, I can expand on that a little bit more. So basically, the way the law worked is you were free if your mother was free, right? So, like you said, people who had white mothers would have been born free. So that, especially in the colonial period, that's a really core way that free people of color end up being free persons. Or if your mother's Native American, the same rule would generally apply. There's some exceptions with Native Americans who had been enslaved. And then you said people were freed by the person who held them in slavery. So yeah, that's true. How that worked is that would have been called manumission. And the process of manumission could occur through a variety of different means. So you could have a person who's enslaving people who simply frees the people that he or she owns, maybe because they have some type of relationship with that person, or there's some family connection, something of that nature. Also, people will purchase themselves, so they will go out, work a trade often, save up enough money, and then go to the person who's enslaving them and say, can I buy my freedom? They'll name some type of price, and they sign paperwork, and that's how that would be done. Other people would have maybe a family member, a friend, who would go about that same process, save up the money, and purchase that person's freedom. Some people would even go out and make like an agreement where they would get a loan, basically, and say, if you purchase me out of slavery, I'll pay you back X number of dollars. And so that kind of arrangement takes place as well. There are a few other ways as well.
Let me ask you this question too, because it's very important to the topic that we're going to get in on the second speaker. Do you cover the period where you could be free, but you had to be out of the state within 30 days or whatever?
Right. Yeah, I mentioned that law because there's a law that's passed. I'm thinking this is like maybe 1830s.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. And it's based off of laws that exist in other states, particularly Virginia. Virginia often is the pioneer in discrimination when it comes to free people of color.
And the reason why I brought that up is they did it here in Edenton, I saw some records there, but they were working very closely with Virginia. That's why I brought it up.
Right.
And by the way, that is when this really got bad, this is where you ended up with people who look white. A way of protecting them was to change their designation on the census records. You would see them, say in 1760, they would be mulatto, and in the 1780 census, they would be white. And then by the time it got to 1810, 20, on up to 1830 and 40, that's when you start seeing a lot of the free people of color who were designated as mulatto disappeared because they were being what we call reconstituted as white persons. I mean, right here in the area. Now, they, and the reason why I'm bringing that point up, some of them left, and the ones, as I said, that hadn't made anybody mad and so forth, everybody knew what was going on and said nothing. They became white and stayed white and died white, right here.
Right.
Now, I found out that, I'm going to say this because the Journal of Negro History did a whole compilation of their publications. And when I went and looked in there, they had left out the obituary sketches. They had a 50-volume publication, and the obituary sketches were left out. And I had a fit and went to the editor and said that needed to be compiled and put back in. And he said, and why? I said, because, in typical fashion, with a smirk on my face. Black people do not tell lies on their obituaries. Now, you all know that, don't you? If you black, you know that. So you're going to find stuff out in that obituary that you may or may not want to know. I had a cousin that died, and my phone in Durham was ringing off the hook in my office because everybody thought they were white, and he had put in that he was black. In other words, he couldn't die with that on his situation. So that almost had the whole family explode because they thought they knew her better. But I brought that up because this is very important knowledge to know, so that when you're going through these census records and all of this other stuff, you will know what you are looking at. Because people know how to hide in plain sight. So I thought I would share that because a lot of times that even slips by the researchers at Chapel Hill and other places.
I guess it's going to follow up that before the gentleman came in, you said in 1619, when slaves were coming over, that they weren't intended to be kept as slaves, or they weren't intended to be kept for their lifetime, and they were basically indentured servants. Is that correct? Did I hear that correctly? Okay, so if they were coming over as more indentured servants, then when did they become slaves?
Those people didn't become slaves.
Some did become slaves.
They were free. And by the way, some of those people got so wealthy they owned slaves.
So we're just talking about depending on what ship it was?
They came over directly as slaves for life, starting around 1715 in earnest. And that's when North Carolina had its first slave laws on how you should act and what you could do and all this other kind of stuff. If you were a slave, you couldn't get together with more than 3 people. A group of more than 3 was a violation and so forth. So it was pretty tight.
So the first group were indentured, and then the next group were slaves. So that's how you had as many free people of color.
Yeah.
Well, is it evolved? Did it evolve to that? I said, did it evolve to that?
Yes. The reason why they really started bringing slaves in was because they couldn't get indentured service from Europe and so forth to come. After things got better in Europe, people decided they didn't want to come over here. And so that's when they started bringing slaves in earnest. So that was about 1720. The first ones that came in as permanent slaves came from the islands, Barbados and so forth.
All right, sir.
Is there a particular What created animus between the races? Because, you know, when you look historically, early on, there was relatively little animus or sort of division, and then over time, it became more and more pronounced. With certain trends, certain specific events that created it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a general answer for you is politics. That people are, you know, find out pretty early that they can use these differences in order to gain control or to take away power from people that they don't, who are not on their side. So I think that's just the bare base of it. You know, as far as like a larger evolution, you know, people are playing off of a variety of different ideas. So, you know, we talk about, say, 1619, but slavery's been going on in the Americas for much longer than that. The Spanish are enslaving people. Native American people have their own ideas about slavery and enslaving people. So, and then of course you go to Africa, to Europe. These ideas have been around a long time. And so, you know, the idea that people can use difference, whether it's status difference, color difference, things of that nature, to divide people is not particularly new. And so what's just happening is that people are coming up with new ideas about how to manipulate that for particular reasons. And like I said, in a lot of cases, it's political.
Right. And economic.
I'd just like to say something about the first Africans arriving in Virginia. They were taken to Virginia by English privateers who had captured them off a slave ship off the coast of Mexico. They'd been carried across the Atlantic on a ship called the St. John the Baptist in either Portuguese or Spanish. And they originated from what's now Angola. And that ship is interesting because it was the third European-style ship ever built in Japan.
Wow.
And it had made a voyage from Japan to Acapulco in about 1616, carrying a deputation of about 80 Japanese on their way to the Vatican.
Wow.
And there's a full-size replica of it now at the port in Japan where it was built.
Okay.
Yes, sir. What impact did the Dred Scott case have on the 1857 North Carolina State Constitution?
Right, the Dred Scott case, that's interesting. So, you know, in the Dred Scott case, Judge Tawney makes suggests the idea that persons of color, people of African descent, are not citizens, right? So that's one of the key aspects, and they don't have certain rights because they're not citizens. And so what we see in North Carolina is there is a contrast between what he's saying and what's actually going on. And this is happening in other places as well. It's pretty clear that lawmakers in North Carolina, those who are in the majority anyways, see free people of color as citizens. They are citizens of the state of North Carolina, and it's brought up time and time again. So in the late 1850s, early 1860s, there's several efforts to try to enslave free people of color, where there are lawmakers who want to require free people of color to either leave the state or become enslaved. And so in those debates, it comes up over and over again that free people of color are citizens, and therefore you can't enslave citizens, even if they want to volunteer to become enslaved, because that's another idea they throw out. They can't volunteer to become enslaved because they're citizens of the state of North Carolina. And so they're basically, they're concerned with, they're people who are concerned with the idea that if we allow free people of color to be enslaved, that, you know, this could lead to other categories of citizens also being enslaved in a future time. So they're trying to avoid that. You know, there are other states that don't see free people of color as citizens, and they move forward with these types of laws, or they bend their laws maybe to hire out people who've been convicted of crimes, long-term, things like that. But in North Carolina, it's pretty clear that free people of color are citizens. They're not equal citizens compared to white people, but they are citizens. And so the Dred Scott case and its impact it varies. because, we think about it as this major moment, major change in the status of people of color, but it really depends on where you're at. And I think a lot of historical research is showing that citizenship, these ideas that we think of as very nationally defined, are actually very locally defined in the 1800s, especially before the Civil War.
This is a good place to stop, because then we can lead right in with the other discussion. And when he finishes his presentation, we'll have both of you up and you can both answer questions.